By me, Cowboy, I have nowhere left to go. She said it without lifting her face, and the room went so quiet you could hear the lantern hissing on its hook. Jonas Wade had walked into Red Fork, Arizona territory for a sack of nails and a quiet drink. He would walk out with a woman, a debt, and a war he had not asked to be part of, and by sundown half the town would want him dead for the choice he had not yet realized he was about to make. It was the spring of 1873, and Red Fork, Arizona territory had still not learned the new century would never come for some of its people. The land out past the last fence post belonged to nothing on paper and to everything in memory. Jonas Wade had been working that land for 11 years, and for 9 of them he had worked it alone. His wife was buried under the cottonwood at the bend of the creek, and his son was buried beside her, and the second wedding ring he had bought for the day. He could no longer stand the silence sat in a tin box on the mantel where he kept the things he could not bring himself to throw away. He woke at 4. He drank his coffee black and standing. He worked until his shoulders ached, and then he worked another hour because the ache was the only thing that reminded him he was still a man and not a habit. The neighbors had stopped calling on him after the second winter. The preacher had stopped after the third. By the 5th year only the dog came up the path, and the dog had died in his arms on a Tuesday in November, and he had buried it under the same cottonwood with the same shovel, and he had not cried because he was not sure he remembered how. The country around Red Fork, Arizona territory was the kind of country that punished softness and starved sentiment. The hills smelled of sage and creosote and the iron of old blood the rain had not finished washing away. In the dry months the wind came down off the mesa like a hand that wanted something. In the wet months the creek ran the color of weak tea and carried with it the broken planks of upstream lives. People who said the West was empty had never stood at a fence at dusk and listened to the way the empty was full of things that did not want to be remembered. That was the country Jonas Wade had made his peace with. That was the country a woman named Nayeli was about to walk into without knocking, and the country, and the man, and the woman, and the silence between them, were about to learn what they were each made of. What Nayeli said next, she said in English clean as a missionary's, and the cleanness of it was the first thing that surprised Jonas Wade more than the rest. He had expected a plea or a curse or the silence of someone who had decided the world was finished with her. He had not expected the words to be ordered, and he had not expected the order to be the kind a person uses when they have rehearsed the sentence on a long ride and settled on the version that will not break them to deliver. By me, Cowboy, I have nowhere left to go. She said it without lifting her face, and the room went so quiet you could hear the lantern hissing on its hook. Jonas Wade had walked into Red Fork, Arizona territory for a sack of nails and a quiet drink. He would walk out with a woman, a debt, and a war he had not asked to be part of, and by sundown half the town would want him dead for the choice he had not yet realized he was about to make. She did not repeat it. She did not soften it. She let it sit in the air between them the way a man sets down a glass he intends to come back to. Behind her, the morning kept its slow business. A meadowlark on a fence post, a thread of smoke rising from somewhere south, the soft creak of leather as his own horse shifted weight in the corral. Jonas Wade felt the wedding band on his left hand the way a man feels a stone in his boot when he is too tired to stop and shake it out. He had buried 2 graves under the cottonwood. He had not opened his door to a stranger in 9 years. He did not know this woman, did not know what she carried, did not know what would walk up the path behind her by sundown. He only knew that the way she stood, with her wrists unaccusing and her chin level, was the way a person stands when they have nothing left to bargain with and they are not asking you to feel sorry for them. They are asking you to be the kind of man you say you are. Jonas Wade did the thing he did when he needed to think. He took his hat off, slow, and ran his thumb along the inside of the band where his own initials had worn smooth. Then he stepped to one side of the doorway and he said the 4 words he had not said to another human being in 9 winters. He said, "You had better come in." Inside, the cabin smelled the way a man's cabin smells when no one has cooked in it on purpose for years. Coffee burned twice that morning, smoke from the iron stove, the dry, sweet smell of cedar in the rafters. Jonas Wade did not look at her while he moved around her. He set a clean tin cup on the table and filled it. He cut a heel of yesterday's bread and set it beside the cup. He laid a folded wool blanket on the chair nearest the stove. Then he stepped back and stood with his shoulder against the doorframe and let her decide whether to sit. Nayeli did not sit right away. She looked at the cup the way a person looks at a thing they have not been allowed to choose for a very long time, and the look was harder for Jonas Wade to watch than her earlier silence had been. When she finally sat, she did it carefully, the way a person sits who has been hit recently in places the eye cannot see. She did not reach for the cup. She did not reach for the bread. She put her hands flat on the table on either side of the cup and she said, softly, that she had walked all night and she did not know the name of the man whose porch she had knelt on. But she had been told by a peddler at the crossing that there was a rancher this side of the creek who did not turn people away. The peddler had been wrong, she said. The rancher had turned everyone away for 9 years. She had counted on the rumor anyway because she had nothing left to count on. Jonas Wade pulled out the other chair and sat down opposite her, and the wood gave its small familiar protest under his weight. He asked her one question and one question only. He asked her who would come looking for her. Nayeli looked at him then for the first time, full on, and the look went through him in a way he had not been gone through since the morning his wife had told him she could not feel the baby moving anymore. She said the name of a man who lived at the far end of the valley. She said it without flinching. She said the man would come within the day, and he would bring at least 2 others, and that if the rancher would let her sit until the worst of her trembling passed, she would walk on, and he would not have to be part of what was about to follow her down the road. Jonas Wade listened to her finish and then he stood up. He took the wedding band off his left hand and set it in the tin box on the mantel and closed the lid. He came back to the table and he picked up the cup of coffee and he set it gently between her hands, and he said, drink. Then he said, eat. Then he said, no one is walking on today. By the time the sun was a hand's width above the mesa, Nayeli had eaten half the bread and drunk the cup down twice, and the shaking in her hands had quieted enough that Jonas Wade could see the calluses on her palms. Not the soft kind a woman gets from household work, but the hard pale ridges of a person who had pulled rope and turned earth and carried water for as many years as she had been old enough to lift. He had calluses in the same places on his own hands. He noticed it and looked away. Nayeli noticed him noticing and did not say anything. The thing about silence between 2 people who have both worked hard for a long time is that it does not have to be filled. It only has to be honored. He brought her a basin of warm water and a clean linen cloth and set them on the bench by the window, and he stepped outside without saying anything so that she could wash without an audience. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and he listened to the small sounds of water moving inside his own house, and he thought, against his will, about the sound his wife used to make humming under her breath while she did the same. He had not let himself think about that sound in 7 years. He let himself think about it now for the length of a single breath, and then he put the thought back where he kept it. When he came inside again, she had folded the cloth into a perfect small square on the bench and set the basin beside it, the way a guest leaves a thing in a stranger's house when they want the stranger to know they were raised somewhere. She was standing near the mantel. The tin box was where he had left it. The lid was closed. She had not touched it. But her eyes were on the second thing on the mantel, the carved wooden horse no bigger than a man's thumb, the one his son had been holding on the morning the fever took him. She looked at it the way she had looked at the cup. She did not ask. Jonas Wade crossed the room and took the little horse off the mantel and put it in her hand and closed her fingers around it without a word. And Nayeli, who had not cried in front of a man in the whole of her grown life, did not cry now either. She only nodded once, and she put the small wooden horse in the inside pocket of her dress, close to her ribs, and she said, "Thank you," in a voice so small the wind almost took it. He nodded back. Then he went outside to chop wood he did not need, because his chest was doing a thing it had not done in 9 years and he did not want her to see it on his face. They came up the road at 1:45, 3 of them, and the dust they raised hung in the still air like a stain on clean linen. Jonas Wade had been watching the road since the second cup of coffee, and so he saw them while they were still half a mile out. He laid the axe down against the chopping block. He walked to the porch and took his rifle off the peg by the door, and he leaned it inside the doorframe where he could put a hand on it without showing it. Then he stepped down off the porch and stood in the middle of the yard with his hat tipped low and his hands loose at his sides, and he waited. Nayeli watched him from the window. He did not turn around. He did not have to. He knew she was there. He could feel her there the way a man feels weather coming. The 3 riders pulled up at the edge of the yard, and the lead rider, Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork, did not get down. He set both hands on the saddle horn and he smiled the smile of a man who has paid for the courtesy of being smiled back at and is owed change. He said Jonas Wade's name like a question and then like an accusation. He said he had heard a rumor that a certain woman had come up this road in the night. He said he was the woman's lawful guardian and the law was on his side and he had come to collect what belonged to him. Jonas Wade listened to all of it without interrupting. He had a particular way of listening when he was deciding what to do with a man, and the way involved not moving the muscles of his face. When Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork was finished, Jonas Wade said 3 sentences. He said the road past his fence was a public road and they were welcome to ride it. He said his porch and his door and the woman inside his house were not on that road. Jonas Wade sat in the chair by the door with the rifle across his knees, and Nayeli sat in the chair by the stove with her hands folded in her lap, and for a long time neither of them said anything because the storm was saying enough for both of them. Then, when the worst of the wind had passed and the rain had settled into the steady kind, Nayeli began to speak. She did not look at him while she spoke. She looked at the small carved wooden horse, which she had taken back out of the inside pocket of her dress and was holding in both hands. She told him things in pieces. She told him about a brother who had not come home from a winter hunt 3 years ago, and the man who had brought back the brother's saddle and asked for her hand in repayment as if a saddle and a sister were the same kind of debt. She told him about the day she had said no and the night that had followed it. She told him about the year that had followed that. She told him about the road and the peddler and the rumor that had brought her to his porch. She did not ask for pity. She did not ask for promises. She told him these things the way a person tells the truth at a grave. Not because the dead need to hear it, but because the living finally do. When she was finished, Jonas Wade did not speak right away. He let the silence sit until the silence had earned the right to be broken. Then he stood up and he walked to the stove and he refilled both cups. And when he set hers down in front of her, he set his hand for 1 second over the back of her hand, and then he took his hand back and sat down again, and the storm outside kept doing what it had come to do, and inside the cabin 2 people who had been alone in different ways for a long time understood, without saying it, that they would not be alone in the same way again. It was past midnight when Nayeli told him the last of it. The storm had thinned to a steady whisper on the cedar shakes, and the iron stove had burned down to coals that shifted now and then with the small voice of settling wood. Jonas Wade had not slept. Nayeli had not slept either. They had not pretended to. There is a kind of waiting 2 people do together that is more honest than most of the things people say in the daytime, and they had done that waiting for hours, and at the end of it Nayeli stood up and went to the window and put her hand flat against the cold glass, and she told him the part she had been holding back. She is carrying her late husband's unborn child, and the Baron knows it. That is why he wants her. She told it without theatrics. She told it the way a person tells you what is underneath the thing on top, because by then the thing on top was no longer enough to explain why the road behind her was as full as it was. Jonas Wade listened with his hands folded on the table and his eyes on her back. When she was finished, he did not stand up right away. He sat very still and let what she had said arrange itself inside him in a new shape. It changed several things. It changed who the men on the road were and why they had come. It changed what was actually at stake in his yard. It changed what the morning would have to look like if both of them were going to walk out of it. But it did not change the only thing that, in the end, mattered to Jonas Wade, which was the decision he had already made when he had set the cup between her hands at breakfast. He stood up. He came to the window and he stood beside her without touching her. And he looked out at the darkness past his own reflection, and he said one sentence. He said, "The road past my fence is still a public road, and they are still welcome to ride it, and my porch and my door and the woman inside my house are still not on it, and that has not changed because the names of the men have changed." He said it slowly, and then he turned and went and stoked the stove, and the coals shifted, and outside the storm finally broke, and the last of the rain came down soft as breath. At first light he saddled both horses. He did not ask her if she could ride. He had already seen her hands and her calluses and the way she had moved among the chores the afternoon before, and a man who has worked beside another worker for 1 day does not need to ask. He brought the second horse around to the porch and he handed her the reins. She took them without a word. Jonas Wade went back inside and he opened the tin box on the mantel and he took out the second wedding ring, the one he had bought for the day he could no longer stand the silence, and he looked at it for a long breath, and then he closed his hand around it and put it in the pocket of his vest and walked out of the cabin and did not look back. He rode with her 2 miles south to a fork in the road where the cottonwoods thickened along the creek. There he stopped his horse and turned in the saddle. He told her that this fork led to a family he trusted, a Mexican family who had taken in his wife's cousin during the second winter of the bad years, and had been quiet about it, because quiet was the only kindness people could afford in this country. He told her the name of the man and the name of the woman and where the gate latch was hidden when no one was home. He told her the family would not ask her questions she did not want to answer, and that he would ride back to his ranch and stand on his porch alone when the men came, and that whatever happened in his yard at sundown was his to carry and not hers. He said all of this without raising his voice. Nayeli sat very straight in the saddle and she listened, and when he was finished she did the thing he had not expected her to do. She turned her horse around. She rode back the way they had come. She did not argue. She did not explain. She simply went, and Jonas Wade watched her go for a count of 3 breaths, and then he turned his own horse and followed her, because a man who has buried 2 graves under a cottonwood already knows what it costs not to follow the people who choose him. They came again at sundown, and this time there were 6. The sheriff rode at the front with Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork a half-length behind him, and 4 hired hands strung out behind them, and the sun was low and red across their faces and made the whole party look like a thing painted on a wall. Jonas Wade was on the porch with his hands resting on the rail and his rifle leaning inside the doorway untouched. Nayeli was beside him. She had refused to wait inside. She stood half a step in front of him and a half a step to his right, the way a person stands when they have decided not to be defended without their consent. The sheriff pulled up at the gate and called Jonas Wade's name. Jonas Wade answered him by name back, and the answering was a courtesy, and the courtesy was the last one he intended to extend. The sheriff said he had a warrant. Jonas Wade said he would be obliged to see it. The sheriff held up a folded paper, and Jonas Wade stepped down off the porch and walked to the gate and took the paper and read it with the same care he read his Bible, and when he was finished he folded it again and handed it back, and he said, "This paper does not have her name on it." The sheriff blinked. Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork from the back said, "That is a clerical error," and Jonas Wade said, "Then ride back to town and clerical correct it and bring it back and I will read it again." He said it without smiling. He said it with his hands still empty. He said it the way a man says a thing he has the law on his side of for the first time in a long time and intends to use that side fully. The sheriff hesitated. Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork, from the back, made the mistake of putting his hand on his pistol. Nayeli, without lifting her own hands from where they were folded at her waist, said one Apache word in a voice that carried, and from the cottonwoods at the edge of the yard came an answer. A single low call that was not a bird and not a dog and made the 4 hired men sit very still in their saddles. 2 riders came out of the trees with rifles laid easy across their forearms. Not pointed, not lowered, only present. Her brother's brother, and his son. They did not say anything. They did not have to. The sheriff looked at the riders. The sheriff looked at Jonas Wade. The sheriff looked at Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork, who had taken his hand off his pistol very slowly. And the sheriff, who had not asked to be part of this and who had a wife and 3 children and only 12 years until his pension, turned his horse around without a word, and Garrick Hollis, cattle baron, owns half of Red Fork and the 4 hired men, after a long beat, did the same. The dust they raised this time hung longer in the air because the air itself seemed reluctant to let them go. The riders from the cottonwoods did not come up to the porch. They lifted their hats once to Nayeli, and she lifted her hand once to them, and they turned their horses and went back the way they had come, and that was the whole of the greeting. Jonas Wade watched them go. He did not ask her how they had known to be there. He had a guess. He let the guess stay a guess. Some things, between 2 people who are still learning how to live in the same quiet, do not have to be examined right away. He went inside. He set fresh coffee on. He sliced bread and cheese onto a plate. He set the plate in the middle of the table where 2 people could reach it without either one having to ask. Nayeli came in after him. She hung her shawl on the peg by the door where his hat had hung alone for 9 winters. She sat down. She took the small wooden horse out of the inside pocket of her dress and set it on the table between the plate and the cups, and she looked at Jonas Wade, and Jonas Wade looked at her, and neither one of them said anything for a long minute, and then she smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since she had knelt on his porch. He had earned it. He knew he had earned it. He did not smile back the way a man smiles to be polite. He smiled back the way a man smiles when he has just remembered something he had thought he would never have again. The prairie keeps its secrets. The cottonwoods at the bend of the creek keep theirs. What happened on that porch and inside that cabin and across that yard at sundown would be told for a generation in Red Fork, Arizona territory, and then for another generation after that, and then it would slip the way all true stories slip, into the bones of the land and the silences of the families that came after. But on the morning we leave them, the kettle is on, and the door is barred against nothing, and 2 people who had been alone in different ways are not alone in the same way anymore. If a story like this one stayed with you tonight, you already know what to do. Stay with us for the next one. The road past the fence is still a public road, and there are still people walking it, and there are still porches waiting to be knelt on.